So why don't we get started? So hello, everyone, and welcome to William James College's Center for Multicultural and Global Mental Health, Asian Mental Health Program speaker event. Today we have President Frank Wu speaking on Beyond Black and White Civil Rights After COVID-19. President Wu is the president of Queens College in New York. But before I wanted to introduce him. I'm honored to introduce President Wu. He has a prolific resume, so I'll be only highlighting a few today. So President Wu was both Chancellor and Dean, and William L. Prosser Distinguished Professor at University of California, Hastings College of the Law in San Francisco. He was on faculty at Howard University, the nation's leading historically Black college university. He was Dean of Wayne State University Law School. And in many of these settings, if not all, he was the first Asian American to serve in these capacities. He was also appointed by the United States Department of Education to his National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity, which advised the administration on higher educational accreditation. He was also appointed U.S. Defense Department to the Military Leadership Diversity Commission, which submitted to Congress the report from Representation to Inclusion. He served on the board of the Leadership Conference and Civil Rights Education Fund. And most importantly, he wrote the book Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White. And so before I turn over to President Wu, I wanted to really talk about how this came about. And when I was in graduate school, I read the book Yellow, and it was one of the most significant books that I read from that time, and really talking about race and talking about beyond Black and white. And I'll share with you, I don't know if you know the story, but in my graduate program, we have what we call here as a diversity clout course. But before we even entered the program, we had this called racism awareness workshop. So there are about 20 students, first-year students, never met each other. We were there for a Saturday, Sunday workshop. The professor walked to the blackboard and put black and white. He turned to us and he said, "We will be talking about race. There's only black and white, and the rest of you, everyone else is in between." I can tell you it was shocking. I turned to my colleagues, and we're all very diverse, and I said, "Did you know that we're in the middle somewhere? Did you know that I didn't have a race?" And that really set the tone for my graduate program. And it was a very confusing time. And so when this book came out, it really, and we've talked about this, you really were able to put words and to say that I wasn't alone and that other people experienced. So I really appreciate that. So fast forward, we brought this book into the first Asian American course at William James College. And again, it continued to really challenge our students talking about race and identity. And so I was so happy when President Wu agreed to come to our program today to speak to us. So I'm going to hand it over to you and just really give you an opportunity to really speak to us today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. Our mutual friend, Cheryl Wu, is here. She's on the faculty at Gallaudet, the unique institution serving deaf and hard of hearing. I had the honor of serving on the board of trustees there for a decade. And I'll just mention, everywhere that I've gone to institutions with missions, it's been life-changing. I was the first Asian American law professor at Howard University. I was there for a decade as well. And it opened my eyes to the privileges I enjoyed without noticing, to the prejudices I had, and to the color line, because so many people wondered why it was that I was there. And when I was at Gallaudet as a trustee, whenever I was on campus, I realized the interpreters were all there for me. What I mean by that is I was the one who was disabled, because there, everything is bilingual. It's in ASL and English, and everyone else was perfectly fluent. They were able to socialize. They had board discussion of the most important academic and financial matters, and they could all do that without an interpreter. But I couldn't. And so being these places where initially it might seem that I didn't belong or didn't fit in, really enriched my own life and set me on this course. So I'm going to tell a short story about why I wrote Yellow. Then I'll share with you the two main points that I make in the book. Now, it's a 400-page book. As a law professor, it took me 400 pages to make 2 points. But I'll share those with you very briefly. And then I'm happy to engage in conversation and dialogue, including with everyone who's here on the Zoom screen. It's really an honor and privilege to be here at William James College. So I'm a kid from Detroit, the Motor City, the American Midwest. I was born in the States in 1967. My parents had come from China via Taiwan, and they came in the early 60s. They put down new roots. My father had found a job with Ford Motor Company, one of the major US automakers. And, to tell you the truth, when I was a kid, because you were expected to assimilate and to fit in, remember the concept of diversity or multiculturalism or DEI, none of that existed in the 1970s. Those terms had to be invented. People really didn't talk about the issues that we talk about now. And even if they did, it was uncomfortable conversation. So when I was a kid wanting to assimilate, I just wanted to be like any other kid. And that meant that if you had raised issues of race or civil rights, I would have just wanted to ride my bicycle around the block and not be involved in any of that awkward stuff, right? Actually, when I was young, I wanted to be an architect when I grew up. So my parents had bought a secondhand drafting table, and I sat in the basement and designed houses. But along the way, I realized I had to stand up and speak out, be an advocate. And so I went to law school. The reason is, I'm just going to tell you a very short version of this. In 1982 in Detroit, somebody was murdered. His name was Vincent Chin. He's not somebody I knew, but when I learned about his story, I knew that could be my uncle, my brother, or even me. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of his story because it inspired me. It was a tragedy, but for so many Asian Americans, it's an important story. And his name is not very well known. So before I tell you about his murder, I have to explain a little bit about 1982 in Detroit. So all through the late 70s, there was a recession in the United States. It was actually worse than what we went through in 2008. It was worse because, while in the United States, unemployment was in the double digits and inflation was in the double digits, it looked like parts of the rest of the world were really taking off, in particular, Japan. People talked about Japan Incorporated, how the Japanese were buying American sports teams, landmarks, companies, and how the power that was defeated during World War II was now taking over the world. There was this real fear. Now, it sounds almost funny to us now because Japan didn't take over the world, right? But back in the 70s and early 80s, people in America were worried Japan was going to take over everything, because Japan seemed to be doing well while America was suffering. That's a very important part of this context. And Detroit is called the Motor City because everyone there was involved in manufacturing automobiles, like my family. My father worked for one of the automakers. That's why we were there. And this too is hard to believe unless you're at least, I think, 50 years old, which some of us are. It used to be everyone drove American cars. Nobody drove cars with funny names like Honda or Subaru or Toyota because, pardon the language, that was jack crap. So if you bought an imported car, people would make fun of you. Rich people drove a Mercedes and hippies had Volkswagens, but nobody drove Japanese cars, and there was no such thing as Korean cars in America. But then in the 70s, those cars started to come, and they became very popular. That meant that in Detroit, people were really worried they would lose their jobs, that the factories would close. And they did. Factories closed, people lost their jobs, they lost their livelihoods. They went from being solidly middle class to being on welfare. And they blamed the Japanese and Japanese cars. Okay, so let me tell you about Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was just a guy, normal guy. There was nothing unusual about him. He was 27 years old. He was not a rich guy. He had been adopted from an orphanage in Hong Kong. His father was Chinese American and had actually served in the US military during World War II. His mother had come from China. They weren't able to have children, so they adopted Vincent. And he grew up, as I did, trying to fit in, wanting to assimilate. So he wasn't what some people call the model minority. He had dropped out of college. He'd gone back to school to learn to be a draftsman, to take up a trade. And he was working as a waiter at a Chinese restaurant. He'd found a nice young lady to marry. He proposed. She said yes. And like any other American guy, he and some buddies of his went out for a bachelor's party on a fine summer's night, June 4th, 1982. They went to a seedy part of town. Chin was no saint, and that's actually an important part of the story. He was just a guy. They went to a strip club, and when they were there were two other gentlemen who were white, who were auto workers. That's important. They were auto workers. And they looked over at Chin and they started to use racial slurs, the same teasing and taunting that I was familiar with on the playground. Pardon the language. Witnesses reported they called Chin a chink and they called him a Jap. And they called him, you don't even hear this word anymore, nip, N-I-P. That used to be something that they would say about people from Japan. And then, according to witnesses, one of them, and again, pardon the language, but this is what the witnesses said, and it's so important. One of those men, two white auto workers, one of them looked over at Chin and shouted, "You little motherfucker. It's because of you motherfuckers that we're out of work." Then, after there was a bit of a fight inside the bar, and everyone was thrown out by the bouncer. Those two gentlemen, the white auto workers, challenged Chin to fight some more, but he saw that they had a baseball bat, so he didn't want to do that. So he took off running, and the two men got in their car and they chased after him. They hunted for him, and then they found him. And using that baseball bat, they took repeated swings at his head, his torso, his arms, until they had literally cracked his skull open, and blood and spinal fluid and cerebral matter spilled out and pooled onto the pavement underneath him. And Chin died. He went into a coma. The emergency medical technician who showed up said, "Nobody survives a head wound like that. Your head has been cracked open." So a few days later, he never regained consciousness. A few days later, his family pulled the plug and he died. This meant that to his attackers, even though Chin was Chinese, not Japanese, even though he was an American, not a foreigner, and even though he was working class, he wasn't rich, they blamed him. He represented Tokyo and Toyota. Now, don't get me wrong, it would not have been right if they'd found a Japanese foreigner and killed that person. That would be wrong too. But people with hatred in their hearts don't really care. They targeted someone who was Chinese American and blamed that person for the success of Japanese cars and bludgeoned him to death. So that's mistaken identity twice over. Now, that's not even the shocking part of the story. The shocking part is the two murderers always admitted they never denied they killed Chen. They couldn't deny it. There were dozens of witnesses who watched this. They always said, yes, they did it. And then they said it was a bar brawl, not a hate crime, even though they had shouted all those racial slurs. And that's not even the shocking part. The judge who had the case, so the two defendants, they took what's called a plea bargain, a deal. You read about this. The prosecutors say to the defendants, instead of having a trial, just admit that you did it and we'll give you a lower sentence. Okay. The judge accepted the guilty plea. So remember, these two men were guilty. They admitted they were guilty. The judge sentenced them to probation for 3 years and a fine of $3,000. So they never went to prison. When I read about this case and learned about it, I realized that you couldn't just pretend that these issues didn't exist. You couldn't just ride your bicycle around the block. That even though I wanted to be an architect, I had to be an advocate. I had to stand up and speak out that words aren't just words, that these racial slurs are fighting words, that they lead to violence. When I was a kid and this sort of thing happened on the playground, not with the same fatal results, but it always begins with those words. The teachers would say to me, just reply, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And even as a kid, I wasn't so sure about that. The words pack their own punch. The words cause trauma that lasts permanently. And the words lead to the sticks and stones. So that case inspired me. And out of that tragedy, out of the death of that individual, a movement was born. And the idea of Asian Americans was born. You see, Asian American was a term that had only been invented in 1968. There were two young activists in California who came up with that term. Because in Asia, most people don't identify as Asians. They identify by a more specific national group or a province or a dialect or their faith. But in America, we're all told you look alike. Right? So Asian American was a way to bring people together, to say our grandparents might have fought one another, but we're here now and we have a common cause. And to say, and we're Americans. So the Vincent Chin case is what really inspired so many, not just me, but many, to say, yes, I'm Asian American. That led me to write the book. So I'm just going to explain the 2 points that I make in the book, and then we'll go to the next question and questions from the audience. I wrote the book because when I was in college, I wanted to write a term paper about race. And I wanted to write a term paper specifically about Asian Americans and civil rights. So I went to the library. Now, some of you are old enough to remember when libraries had a card catalog. Young people don't know what that is because you Google everything. But it used to be when you look things up in actual hard copy books, there was a room, a giant room. It was usually the biggest room in the library. And it had cabinets that had index cards for every book. It would be one for the author, one for the title, and one for the subject. So you could find any book by author, by title, or by subject. So I looked up Asian Americans and civil rights. There were no books. And that wasn't because I was at a bad library. It's because nobody had written that book. So then I thought, well, let me look up race. And I found dozens of books. They were by liberals, they were by conservatives, they were by historians, they were by psychologists, you name it. There were old books, there were new books, and every one that I looked at, it didn't matter. If it was about race in America, it had only 2 boxes, and everyone was black or white, and that's all there was to it. And I thought, there's something wrong here. This picture is not accurate. So I don't mean that your politics matter or that your own ethnicity matters. I'm saying just as a picture of reality, these books didn't present an accurate picture. The picture was distorted. So I thought, well, I want to write a book about Asian Americans and civil rights. And so I went and I looked up Asian Americans, and there were 2 books. That's all there were. I read the books, and then I could say that I knew more about Asian Americans than any of my professors, because they had not read those books. And ultimately, I wrote a book to make first the point that race is not literally black and white, that there are many, many, many different groups, not just Asian Americans. There are Latinos. There are Native Americans. There are people who are proud of mixed ancestries, right? There are, for example, Afro-Asians. And these stories are all important stories. And I wanted to tell the stories in a way that supported the historic struggle for Black equality, to build bridges. So I always make clear in the work that I do, adding Asian Americans into the picture doesn't take anything away from African Americans or others. It should instead help support civil rights principles. And we can talk a little bit more later about how that works. The second point I wanted to make is that race is not figuratively black and white, metaphorically. You see, we tend to talk about race as if it's a story of villains and victims. It's about bigots like the KKK or skinheads. And then it's about people who are passive. They are not agents of their own destiny. They have these wrongs visited upon their bodies and their communities. And there are villains. There always have been, and there still are today. And there are victims too. But when I started working on this book, we didn't have those terms about microaggression, about implicit bias. But that's what I was talking about, that there are also structures and history and so much more where there isn't a racist, where you can't point your finger and say, you are a wrongdoer and we're going to punish you, but where a highway was built 75 years ago right through a Black neighborhood, and it destroyed a vibrant neighborhood. And the people who made the decision to build the highway thought of themselves as good people who were building a highway that people needed, but they were indifferent to the fact that it would go right through the Black neighborhood and destroy a neighborhood. Because those planners looked and they said, that's just a slum, we don't care about it. And those folks will be better off if we knock down all the houses, right? So 75 years later, we have the consequence. We have a highway. The people who made those decisions are dead. And we can't say the highway is racist, but it has consequences which are racial. Because it used to be, there was a great neighborhood that people lived in, worked in, cared about, raised their children in. And that neighborhood is gone because of that highway. And people were scattered and dispersed. So there are so many decisions that were made that if you looked at it, you wouldn't say this decision is bigoted, but the consequences, when you add it all up, it has an effect. And you can trace so many of the disparities that we face today, which are tangible, measurable, right? So this isn't just in somebody's head, and it's not just symbolism. There are real differences. For example, in access to healthcare, right? Who has easy access to a hospital? Who has prenatal care? And that access to the hospital and that prenatal care affects your life chances, right? That's why women of color die at much higher rates than white women when they're pregnant. And it's why American women die at such high rates compared to other industrialized nations. So my book makes 2 points. The first is we should include everyone. And the second is, if we really care about the ideals we say we care about, we must be attentive to what is more subtle, what isn't the in-your-face version of bigotry, but which added up, just like water that erodes stone, added up, that drop of water again and again and again has an effect that's incredibly, profoundly powerful. So that was my answer to your first question.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And again, for whoever hasn't read the book, Yellow, I actually skimmed back it last night. I was like, it's bringing back memories, just but also to your point, I want to mention Dr. Vincent Chin, because as we learned about it in the class, I think many of the students were not aware of this history. This was not talked about in our educational system, and it was a shock to them. But what I appreciated coming out of that case was that the activism that came out of the Asian American community. And if I'm correct, I think that was the first time that the Chinese community, the leading group, really stood up and started to, like, civil rights movements, and really became a partner, really started to speak up. And to speak to your point about allyship and building connections, I think fast forward even today, what do we saw during the pandemic, Black Lives Matter movement, and then so as a program and as for students, we're like, where are we as Asian Americans to stand up and speak up about this as well, because we tend to stay more silent. We tend to try to stay out of it as we're taught. But I think this is a move now that we need to speak up. So I wonder if you can share some thoughts about that.
Absolutely. The Vincent Chin case was so extreme, it brought people together. So it didn't matter whether you were an immigrant or native born, whether you were older or younger, whether you were professional or working class, if you were suburban or lived in Chinatown. And it attracted the support of so many others. Even though Chin was of Chinese descent, people who were Japanese American and anyone who was of East Asian descent understood that could have been me. Because nobody pauses and asks, oh, what exactly is your ancestry, before they shout those slurs and take out that baseball bat. And then people who were white and Black, who were Latino and Jewish, also just were shocked. How could you take a baseball bat, beat someone to death, admit that you did it, and not go to prison? That's just shocking, no matter what your background is. So the Detroit chapter of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, so that's the leading African-American civil rights group, supported this movement for Vincent Chin. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, who at the time was a very prominent leader, gave speeches about this issue. So the Chin case brought people together in a way that no one had ever seen before. Then, over the past year, the violence during the pandemic, that brought people together again. Initially, even friends of mine would say, well, maybe this is random. How do you know this is racial? They wanted to deny or downplay that these were hate crimes. And then they would say, well, it's just someone spitting or shoving someone. Maybe that's just New York City, right? But then we saw so many viral videos where it starts with the racial slurs, starts with someone spitting on you, then shoving you. Then it becomes they shove you in front of a subway train. They shove you to the ground and kick you in the head until you're in a coma. They stab you, or in Atlanta, they shoot you. 6 of the 8 victims in that mass murder being Asian women. And we've now seen so many of these videos, it's undeniable, right? So I can't see in anyone's heart or mind. And as a lawyer, I know you need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So do I know that in any one instance that it's definitely racial? No, I don't. But when I see several dozen videos, the shocking one, you've probably seen this. If you haven't, I don't recommend it, but you can find it easily. It was about a year ago, not even a year ago, 8 months ago or so. It was this past spring in New York City. There was a woman, Filipina, in her 60s, walking to church. And this is all captured by security cameras. You can watch the whole thing. Some guy comes along, knocks her to the ground, starts kicking her in the head. She has to go to the hospital in critical condition. So I don't want you to think kicking that's like kids kicking one another. I'm talking getting kicked in the head hard enough, not just to have a concussion, but to have brain damage type kicking in the head. But that's not the shocking part of that video. The shocking part of the video is that at the very end, in the last 2 or 3 seconds, you see 2 gentlemen, big guys. They're the doormen of the building. They come and they literally close the door. They've been watching the woman get kicked in the head. They don't help her. They close the door on the scene and they turn around and they leave. Okay. Now, it turns out the perpetrator in that case was a felon. He had murdered someone. He had murdered his own mother, right? That's a bad human being. But the 2 doormen are just ordinary guys. So the shocking part, beyond just the crime, is that the bystanders did nothing. They didn't care. And when you see all these videos, one after another, after another, after another, you realize, wow, this is a pattern. And then and the ones with audio, the people are shouting, this is your fault, right? Sometimes it's healthcare workers of Asian descent, who are being attacked. So at a certain point, it becomes just undeniable that there's something going on here that violates any sense of decency and our norms. It doesn't matter who you voted for, what your politics are. There is no culture in which it is appropriate to knock 65-year-old women to the ground and kick them in the head. That is bad behavior. And I would say there aren't many cultures in which it's appropriate behavior to see that, witness it, and turn around and walk away, right? Yet, I have hope. I'll explain why. So Queens College is in the World Borough, Queens, New York. It's in a specific neighborhood called Flushing, which over the past 25 years has become heavily Asian. And there was a rally about 6 months ago, right in downtown Flushing. And I was humbled. I was asked to speak, to say a few words. There were about 24 speakers. I went there and there was a big march that was going to happen. And I was looking at the crowd. It's mostly people of Asian descent, young and old, every walk of life. And when my turn came to say a few words, I looked at them and I said, I've never seen this. I've never seen so many Asian Americans asserting their rights, saying, we're Americans and we want to be a part of this society and we're going to stand up for the same ideals that others marched for with Black Lives Matter and in all these other social justice protests. I've never seen hundreds of people of Asian backgrounds. I looked down at this crowd, right, who were going to march in this way. And I said to them, there's something else I've never seen. Senator Chuck Schumer spoke. Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul, she's now the governor of New York, she spoke. members of Congress spoke, clergy spoke. There were speakers who were white, there were speakers who were Black. The Reverend Al Sharpton spoke. There were speakers who were Latino, there were speakers who were Jewish, there were speakers who were gay, every possible group, not just Asian Americans. And I said to this crowd, I've never seen so many people who aren't Asian American come out to support Asian Americans like this. So that gave me hope. And during that time period, a number of friends of mine, people I hadn't been in touch with, but who I'm still connected to on social media, contacted me. They said, "You doing okay? Just wanted to check on you and your elderly father, and just to see, are you facing these issues?" And I don't remember any other time when people reached out that way and said they just wanted to check because they read about, heard about, or seen these videos and seen the scope of this violence. So that gives me hope, because this isn't about Asian American rights. This is about American ideals that we all share, right? And that's our ability to have empathy for one another. Now, the pandemic has both brought that forward and shown shortcomings that not everyone cares about other people. But the pandemic made us acutely aware of the social contract, right? That I wear a face mask or get vaccinated, yes, for my benefit, but also for your benefit, for your kids' benefit, right? That it's not just for me, that there's something bigger than me, and there are public health concerns. And so this moment in human history, we know is an historic moment. What I mean by that is we're always living through history, right? Time is always moving forward. Every moment is an historic moment to the people who will come after us in the future. But we rarely catch ourselves, and we're self-conscious, and we think, wow, this is historic. We've never seen anything like this. Let's hope we're not going to see anything like this again. But our lives are now divided. Before the pandemic, 18 months, and now this future after the pandemic, which we hope will be better. So we are aware of this historic moment. And for Asian Americans, I think this was also a moment when other people became aware that there were Asian Americans, right? So one of the things that I always point out when people ask me to talk about this violence that we've seen is it's not new. There's the Chin case. There's so many others. The Chin case is not the only case. There were lynchings in the 19th century. Mass lynchings of Asian immigrants. And there are, just throughout US history, so many times when there have been racially motivated attacks by white mobs on Asian immigrants. But during the pandemic, suddenly, because of social media, everyone became aware of this in a way that they'd never been aware of it before, and they connected it. And then because of all the movements for Mr. George Floyd and all the African Americans killed, dozens, and that, of course, is in no way new either. But people put this together, and they saw in a way that they hadn't before, that there's a common cause. And that's what gives me hope, this ideal that there's mutuality at the core of these principles. That when I wear a face mask, it's not for me. When I march, it's not just for me, but it's for something bigger than me, right? It doesn't make any sense for me to have a march for me, right? And even a march for people who look like me, well, that's sort of self-interested. It has to be about something compelling that will appeal to people who don't look like me, where they say, I too support that cause because I know that this diverse democracy of ours depends on this mutuality of concern, of obligation.
I guess, no, I really appreciate that you talked about the rally up in New York and that all walks of life came out to support this. I guess I worry that as, social media, the news cycle, it comes and goes. And certainly Asian Americans being attacked, racially attacked, is nothing new. We saw an uptick this past year, and then now it's not so much prevalent, although we still see, but
It's
so how
not in
do
the
we?
news anymore.
No,
right?
so how do we keep this momentum going? Even for Black Lives Matter, it's like it comes and goes. So how do we continue to put this in the forefront, advocate, and really fight for civil rights?
Yeah, none of this happens automatically. I'll give you an example, and then I'm going to talk about something that's a little more self-critical, and others might disagree. Right? So here's something that just happened. On Tuesday, I went to a major event in New York City. I won't mention the details other than to say it was a conference. For many people, it was the first in-person conference they've been to since the pandemic. It was organized by a major New York City institution. It was about building back. It was about the role this institution could play. It was about infrastructure. And there was a DEI theme, diversity, equity, and inclusion theme all throughout. There were at least 24 speakers, maybe more. The speakers included people who were white, included people who were Black, included people who were Latino, included people who were Jewish, included men, included women. It included politicians. It included ordinary folks. It included experts. It included people who worked in this specific field. It included scholars who'd written about the set of issues. And I was glad I went. I was there live in person. And I noticed something. This went about 4.5 hours. It was the whole morning. What I noticed is, even though there were more than 24 speakers, and even though they talked all about DEI, every speaker emphasized diversity. There were 0 speakers of Asian descent, whether East Asian or South Asian, whether immigrant or native born. And this is in New York City, which has lots of Asian Americans. So when they talked about diversity, they didn't think to include anyone of Asian descent. And maybe it was negligence, maybe it wasn't deliberate. I don't know. I wasn't one of the organizers. And look, I'm not complaining out of ethnic pride or just for my own sake. I'd like people to live up to what they say, right? And if you are all about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and you're missing a giant group that's visible, that all throughout the past year has been in the news because of all this violence, and you say diversity, 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 I've wanted to write a little essay entitled, "Hey, would you like to know why Asian Americans are angry at you?" And it would say, it's because you've been excluding them all this time, even when you talk about diversity. That's why they're angry at you, right? I'm not sure I will write that. Maybe you could give me some advice about how to be a good advocate and to persuade people. But now I'm going to say something a little self-critical. Okay. I was saying this at lunch to some of your students, and by the way, the work you're doing is fantastic work. I'm so glad that you're doing what you do. Kudos to you. Every East Asian culture has the equivalent of a proverb. The Japanese one is the best known, and I know I'm generalizing, but the Japanese say the nail that sticks up is pounded down. Okay, there's a Chinese phrase, the loudest duck is shot first by the hunter. Okay, what is this meant to communicate? This is meant to communicate, be quiet, don't make a fuss. I used to hear from my parents, just work harder, right? This is about deference to one's elders. Just listen to what they tell you. It's about fidelity to tradition. It's don't rock the boat. That's the sound. The nail that sticks up is pounded out. It's about conformity, about keeping your mouth shut, right? And I get it. That's a part of Asian culture, and there's culture clash in so many Asian American families between the parents and grandparents who have that view and the kids who are more Americanized. And I'm not criticizing my ancestors. there is a time and a place for the strategies they had. But I just want to point out the American adage, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? This is a diverse democracy. It's about the hurly-burly of the public square. It's about dissent. It's about controversy. And when I've done things like this, been involved in the Vincent Chin protests, my mother would say to me, don't be so controversial. It's bad for your career, right? Well, I've made a career out of being controversial, right? And there's a reluctance that many Asian Americans have. This isn't limited to Asian Americans, but for Asian Americans in particular, there's this cultural aversion that many of them have. It's related to so much of what we've talked about, the psychology. You don't make eye contact with your elders. When your elders are talking to you, you're kind of looking at the floor, right? Because you're polite, you're respectful. You never talk back to them. You don't question them, right? So when I was a kid and I used to face bullying in school, I'd say that to my parents, and they would just say, just work harder, because they were sure that they would say, try to fit in, right? They were sure it was me that I brought it upon myself. So part of my message to Asian Americans is you can't just keep quiet and work hard. People will walk all over you and they'll be resentful. You're working so hard, are you trying to prove you're better than they are, right? Boston just saw something historic happen. Michelle Wu, a 36-year-old Chinese American elected to office. I don't know her. No, I'm not related to her. But I'm going to bet something. She did not get elected to office because she kept quiet. That was not the winning strategy to get voters to support her. She didn't get elected to office because she deferred to her elders, right? So if we want to celebrate that electoral victory, and by the way, she also didn't get elected to office because Asian Americans voted for her. I mean, Asian Americans did vote for her, but she had to have crossover appeal. If every single Asian American in any city in America, except maybe Honolulu or San Francisco, voted for a candidate, that wouldn't mean anything. There just aren't enough. And that's good. That means Asian Americans have to be bridge builders. They have to have coalitions. And I'm not critical of that. I think that's great. It is so important in this diverse democracy, and so important now that we learn again how to reach out to people who don't look like us, whose ancestors didn't come from where our ancestors came from, whose faith is not ours, whose food is foreign to us and vice versa, and to inspire them with some common cause. So a candidate like Michelle Wu has to appeal both to white voters and Black voters. That is not easy, right? But that's something to live up to for Asian Americans. And to turn back to the book Yellow, I sometimes think for Asian Americans, you have to learn how to be an interpreter for your parents, right? There's an awkward role reversal for so many Asian American kids. Their Asian parents and grandparents have accents, or even if they are fluent, they're not as comfortable, and they want the kids to speak for them if there's a dispute with the phone company or you're trying to do business at the bank. But Asian Americans also have to navigate the space that your professor described as in between, except it's not just in between, right? It's much more complicated than that. It's not just this space between white and Black, because when you frame it that way, I would say you're actually making things worse, not better, because you're setting up these two different poles, and Asian Americans suddenly have to make a choice. Well, that's a problem. That reveals more of a color line and reinforces it. There's a different way to think about this. And if you are compelled, because you don't fit in any of the boxes, if you're compelled to question that framework, that's good, right? That will help us undo these boxes.
I think what's hard too is, the paradigm of black and white, right? So we're in the middle, but it's actually not even our choice how to identify. Oftentimes, and we've talked about with students, it's like we're told, other people define who we are. And one of the questions that come up often is, are Asian Americans people of color?
Right.
And I was shocked because I received a text from her colleague and said, are we people of color? I'm like, of course we are. And she said, well, I was just challenged by a white person saying, no, you're not. And it blew my mind. And so that has been a conversation that and some actually students that have Asian says that I actually didn't think so, because it depends on the narrative, the context, and how they're raised. So this has been a question that we've come up to.
Yeah.
We don't get to define who we are.
Right. You don't control your own destiny, right? It's imposed upon you. Stereotypes are scripts that we're expected to follow, right? And part of what's going on is people have an ulterior motive, right? They want you to be closer to whites, closer to blacks for some other purpose that isn't about the interests of Asian Americans, right? Or we're excluded as perpetual foreigners, right? That's the other thing that happens. You're not white, or you're almost white. You're sort of an honorary white, except when you're not, right? So that's the problem. I don't want to be white, not because I'm anti-white, but for two reasons. The first is I'm not sure that it's going to stick, right? That someone who says to me, you're white, well, that's nice of you to say that, right? But when push comes to shove or there's a problem, I'm not so sure you're going to count me as white. That's the first thing. But the second thing is when they say, some people in a flattering, what they think of as a complimentary way, say you're white, what they're really saying is, I like you, okay? I accept you. At least you're not black. So thanks to me, you get to be a white person. You have my approval. I want to say, wait a minute. That's incredibly offensive when you think about when someone says, I don't really think of you as Asian. I don't think of you as a minority. So many of them mean it positively, right? But it's actually deeply offensive, not just to me, it's deeply offensive to black people. It's saying you're okay because I prefer you to black people, right? I'm going to count you in my club so that you're not part of that other club. Right. And so I'm skeptical about how this works. And I realize that it's complicated and it's dynamic, right? It depends on where you go, depends on how much money you have. It depends if the stranger next to you is angry and has had too much to drink or is thinking about the cousin that they lost in the Vietnam War or whatever else, and they put it together. There's this benign, almost benign, it's never really benign, but people like to think of it as innocent form of, I won't call it racism, racial thinking. Oh, you're Chinese? I visited the Great Wall last year. Like, oh, great, did you see my cousin? He hangs out there. Or people, just random people coming up to me to say, I really like Chinese food. Like, oh, yeah, great. I invented that stuff, right? People are trying to connect in some way. And I know they're trying to connect. You speak English so well. Where did you learn your English? Well, down the street from you, you idiot, right? They're trying to connect, but what they're connecting to has nothing to do with me. It's this image of Asia, of an exotic Far East, right? And I'm guilty of this too. That's the other thing that I think it's important to acknowledge. We all have images rattling around in the back of our head, right? And part of achieving the ideals that we talk about is to recognize everyone's carrying around some prejudice. You can't be a human being and not. And probably everyone who's part of this session is aware of the implicit association test. If you're not, you can Google it. Just go online and taken. And the results are astonishing. What's most deeply troubling. What this shows is, for example, we correlate words like white or the color white with positive thoughts, right? Black is correlated with negative thoughts, evil, right? But the true shocker, and it shouldn't be shocking to any psychologist or anyone who studies this, is how internalized it is. So it's not just that white people think of white is good, black is bad. To some extent, and again, we're generalized, but in the aggregate, you can tease this out through the testing. Black people do that too. So if you're part of a stigmatized group, you just absorb this. So in 1954, the Supreme Court decided the Brown versus Board of Education case. That's the one that ended separate but equal. If you study the history of that case, or if you study the history of psychology, very important to the Supreme Court's reasoning there were the experiments done by the Clarks, husband and wife psychologists. What they did was they did all these experiments with African-American kids, girls, 5 years old, 6 years old, schoolgirls, and dolls, white dolls and black dolls. Which one's beautiful, which is good, which one do you want to play with? What they showed is in the segregated South, that the stigma associated with blackness was so strong that even the young black schoolgirls preferred the white dolls and saw the white dolls as beautiful, as pure, as good, and the black dolls as dirty and bad, right? That's how powerful all this is. And there's so much empirical data now, proof, right? That this exists. This is not fiction, it's not made up. And there are practices that we can engage in. So psychologists are so important to this. There are issues of priming, for example, and you can predispose people to be more prejudiced or less prejudiced. And there are very deliberate things you can do, including how you teach, how you structure the classroom, use of language, and so on, that can increase or decrease. You can manipulate this. You can get people to be more bigoted toward one another pretty easily, pretty quickly. Demagogues know how to do this in speeches they give to rallies. Or you can bring about temporary and probably permanent changes in the way that people interact with one another and see one another. So there's so much for us to do. And what Dr. King did that was great in his letter from a Birmingham jail. So if you don't know, it's a very slim book. It's worth looking at to this day. His letter from a Birmingham jail is what it says it is. It's a letter he wrote while incarcerated for engaging in civil disobedience in a jail in Birmingham, Alabama. And it's framed as Dr. King, is going to write to white clergy, fellow leaders of the same faith. And what he did was he did not say, and this was as an advocate, as a lawyer, I admire this so much. He did not say, hey, you're a bunch of bigots. He didn't say you're a bunch of hypocrites. He instead said, you preach from your pulpit about racial justice and reconciliation and everything that is good and just. Live up to it. He challenged them. And that's what's amazing. Yes, there are people at the fringes, right, who are open, outright, in your face white supremacists today, right, who use social media and the internet to recruit the young to their hateful cause, right? Probably very difficult to win any of them over. But by and large, we have a sort of a rough consensus that bigotry is not right, that it is wrong. I don't just mean illegal, that's wrong. That to say this country belongs to people of a specific racial background or only to people of a particular faith, a really broad segment of Americans, regardless of who they are, who they voted for, what region of the country they live in, would say that I don't believe that, especially young people. There are generational differences, and so I'm very positive that there is this consensus about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? that the murder of Mr. George Floyd was a murder perpetrated in broad daylight and recorded by brave citizen journalists. So the challenge for us is not with this group of people. Okay, so there's the remain challenge with the folks who are the hardcore bigots, right? But with the broad consensus, it's to say, okay, you agree that an institution should have people of every background. I'm not talking about a quota. I just mean, if you look at the institution and there's nobody who's a person of color, who's a professor there, or who's a partner at the law firm or whatever, that's trouble. That's not quite right about that. Okay, so we agree on that. How do we get there, right? That's the real challenge. So I know as an advocate, we have to spend some time trying to win over, or at least counteract the real open bigots, where it's not my interpretation of the person's a bigot. They stand up and they say, that's right, I'm a bigot, right? We have to deal with that. But there's a much broader group of people who would say, I'm not a bigot. And I want to say that, okay, you're not a bigot, I'm not a bigot. We do all have these ideas, right, that we have to contend with. But now that we agree on some basic principles, let's make the rhetoric real. Otherwise, it's just a joke, right? Otherwise, it's what kids today would call performative, right? You feel you have to say, I believe in DEI. All right, well, unless you want to get called out for how that's a sham, and that's something that did happen, right? Over the past year, I'm sure this is true of you as well. You know, I got emails from hundreds of companies, nonprofit groups, you know, you name it. If I had ever bought something from them or interacted, an email that said, we believe in diversity, equity, inclusion, right? I would read these and I would say, some public relations person wrote this, and you could swap it for the statement from the next company that sent me the next email. No one would be able to tell the difference. This is just vacuous. And in some instances, you would see on social media, that same company would get called out the next day that message is just totally fake, that they don't live up, they don't live that at all. Like, they said those things. All right, I'm willing as a pragmatist to give people the benefit of the doubt, to say, all right, I read your message, nice message, let's do it, okay? You said you wanted to do this, all right, let's see you invest resources into this and actually get started, right? And it doesn't have to be today, but if it's not tomorrow and sometime soon, then you should be called out for how fraudulent your message is, right? But there's a possibility here.
Thank you for that. So I want to just add to that too, is like, again, how do we build coalitions? How do we allyship? How do we continue this momentum? And I think as I've always said to students or to other people, especially for Asian Americans during this time, as you said, it was so shocking. I think we rallied around when our elders were attacked, when women were attacked, but that was shocking. But I think for us is that we can't stay silent anymore. You know, we can't just depend on the next person to do the work. But we need to be able to communicate and be able to advocate, continue advocating. So continue this moment. So I think this is something that I, as a professor here, part of the Asian American program, is really to talk to our students is you have a voice and you're going to have power, right? In your position as psychologists, privilege, and how do we use our voice? And so I can really appreciate your messages today. What I want to do in the interest of time, though, is please, if you have questions or comments, please put it in the chat. We have two people here that can monitor that. I'm wondering right now, are there any questions that we could answer?
There aren't questions, but Beth made two comments. She said, I spoke with a Black woman in Hyde Park, Forest Hills T station in past year. An Asian woman came to her for support after a white man peed on her in a T station, yelling, "We brought COVID to this country." And a similar event in Randolph, bells rung for Asian women killed in Atlanta. All races of Randolph folks were saying, we stood up when George Floyd killed and Jews killed. Now we need to do for Asians. Lyric.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Thank you, Beth.
No questions. Not in the chat.
Okay, please send in your chats and put in your questions in the chat. We have a large audience out there.
It really is an honor to be here with you in this dialogue because, you know, half of success in life is just showing up, right? And people showing up at events and wanting to talk and to learn. And one of the great things that people in your profession do for their clients is provide validation that the clients aren't alone, that these issues that they perceive, that they're not the problem, right? That they are perceiving something accurately and it has to be redressed, right? For Asian Americans, that's been a long time coming because the general response has been dismissive. You're rich. What do you have to worry about? Right? That's the model minority. You don't have any problems, or go back to where you came from. That's perpetual foreigner syndrome. Even if you're sixth generation, right? Even if you're adopted, right? The notion is, who are you to complain? You're not even a member of this community. You're an outsider, even if you were born and raised in Boston. That's the other thing that's shocking, I think, to many non-Asian Americans. Yes, there are many Asian Americans who are recently arrived, right? And that term fresh off the boat, which was pejorative, has been reclaimed thanks to a hit television show, right? So that's great. But there are sixth generation Bostonians of Asian descent. There are even Asian Americans whose ancestors came on the Mayflower. And when I say that, people scoff and say, all right, now you're going too far. That's because they're mixed. There actually are Asian Americans who, on one side of their family, go back 13 generations in America, right? And these are stories and experiences that we haven't shared, that we don't know about. And in sharing them, we're not just doing people a favor, we're coming to understand better the reality around us and our fellow citizens, our co-workers, our neighbors. Right?
So we had a comment and a question. Johanna said, I truly enjoy hearing you say that there's not only black and white. And then a question from Lin Wing. He asked, I'm curious to know Mr. Wu's thoughts regarding the recent commentary in social mainstream media against critical race theory and what we may take from it.
Yeah, so, you know, most people haven't read critical race theorists. I'm familiar with critical race theory. At one point in my career, I might have been identified as associated with critical race theory. So it's a movement that started about 25 years ago. It's identified in particular with a scholar, he's passed away, the late Derek Bell. He was the first African-American law professor at Harvard. And what critical race theory does is it looks at structures of American society, in particular law, but not just law, and tries to point out what's racial that people haven't noticed is racial. So I mentioned highway construction, right? Most people don't think of highways as racial, right? But if you read the history of Robert Moses, right? So Robert Moses was the fellow who really made New York City what it is, the infrastructure. There's a famous book about him called The Power Broker, and it's thought of that title is apt. He is thought of as one of the most powerful, if not the single most powerful human being for about a quarter of a century at least in New York City. And he was a planner, you know, highways and all that. He built modern New York City. And in some instances, and this is not limited to New York, this would be true of Boston, it'd be true of highways in every urban area. In some instances, the people on the planning council or the city council or mayorhood, they were open, they were explicit. They said, we need to build a highway, let's build it through the Black neighborhood because that's a slum and those folks would be better off anyway. Okay. And in other instances, they weren't open about it. But when you look at all the planning decisions, you look at what neighborhoods had to be knocked down and bulldozed, every one of the neighborhoods was populated primarily by people of color, and the highways weren't designed to run through white neighborhoods. Not just highways where subway stops get located, all right, or where schools are located. So I worked for a federal judge in Cleveland, Ohio. It was the first job I had after law school. So I know the Cleveland public schools. The judge I clerked for, he desegregated the Cleveland schools in the early 1970s. Here's something that was very interesting. This is not limited to Cleveland. Here's something they did when they decided where to put new schools. They only built the schools, the site, in neighborhoods that were racially stable, meaning there wasn't rapid change. The neighborhood had always been Slovakian and appeared to still be Slovakian, or had always been African American, was still African American, where there wasn't transition, where there wasn't change. Why did they do that? Because if you put a neighborhood in some place where there was transition, where there was change, that school would become naturally desegregated, which is not what they wanted, be mixed because of the transition neighborhood. They wanted to put the schools in neighborhoods that were what lawyers call de facto segregated. I mean, it wasn't by law, okay, it's just, it happened that way. It didn't happen by accident, it's a pattern. And so when you look at school siting decisions all throughout the United States, even in places that didn't have Jim Crow black schools and white schools, right? But in the North, the West, that's what they did. They just put the schools in places where you would generate natural segregation. So what critical race theory tried to do is uncover all this, right? To point out that what appears to be neutral or objective has underneath it a lot of racial stuff going on. So it was an effort to show the way all these decisions, including, for example, there have been a couple books written about tax and tax policy, taxation, support for public institutions. A lot of that has racially coded language. You may have heard this term dog whistle politics. That refers to, there are lots of words, there are numbers, there are symbols that get used that no one who isn't in the know would wonder about, where it looks just like a normal word or set of numbers. I'll give you an example. If you ever see a license plate that says 88 on it, that's a vanity plate, or if you see someone with an 88 tattoo, that they're a neo-Nazi. Now, I don't know if any of you know this. 88 is Heil Hitler. H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. So 88 is a coded way of signaling to someone that you're a neo-Nazi. And their whole, if you just look this up, dog whistle, neo-Nazi terms, they're symbols and other things which are normal, right, in some contexts. But if you know the lingo, you spot it. All right. So dog whistle politics refers to things like, where I'm from, in Detroit, there's a suburb right next to Detroit called Dearborn. And Dearborn, all through the 60s, had a segregationist mayor named Orville Hubbard. Okay, but this is in the North, not the South. He never said openly, let's just keep black people out. He didn't say that. He said, keep Dearborn clean. That's dog whistle politics. Keep Dearborn clean meant we keep it white. And everyone knew what he meant, right? But it sounds innocent. Keep it clean. Oh, let's not pollute. Let's not litter. But it was a slogan that avoided openly saying, I'm a bigot. Let's keep the black people out. Keep Dearborn clean that's dog whistle politics. So critical race theory was an attempt to uncover all this. And for whatever reason, I'm actually sort of puzzled by this because in the past 18 months, critical race theory has become way more prominent than it ever was before. That's the funny thing. The attacks on it took a school of thought that probably most American law schools have one critical race theorist on the faculty, right? So it's not that every law professor is a critical race theorist, but suddenly opponents of it elevated its prominence, right? That's the irony of it. Asian Americans are actually part of this. Asian Americans have been recruited. So I think we're almost out of time. I'll note one other thing. So this is a message to everyone who cares about DEI. So you know how I said I might write this op-ed, here's why Asian Americans are angry at you. Part of it would say, and by the way, if you are supportive of civil rights, you should be aware of something. If you don't recruit Asian Americans to your cause, people hostile to civil rights, the historic struggle for Black equality, will recruit Asian Americans because it gives them sort of a racial mascot, right? It gives them a new way to attack diversity programs by making Asian Americans the enemy of African Americans, right? So Asian Americans can be brought into the picture all sorts of ways. One is in a divisive manner, as spoilers, right? Another is in a much more constructive manner. I would rather we do this positively. I want to be part of the picture because the picture is not accurate if I'm not in it. It doesn't have to be me, Asian Americans. But I want to see Asian Americans in the picture helping other people of color, not to have Asian Americans come in the picture to elbow aside someone else, right? It doesn't have to work that way. There's a more progressive approach. And so that's what I've tried to promote through my career. And I hope I've shared a little bit of that with you this afternoon. So thank you again so much.
Well, actually, we do have.
Yeah, one more question.
Oh, okay.
This question is from Kevin. Kevin asks, since AAPI communities represent a broad diaspora, what Asian communities are often excluded from narratives that are discussed about Asian American challenges?
That's a great question. You know, the term Asian American also has a problem, right? Data disaggregation has become this big fight, and every mainstream Asian American organization supports data disaggregation that better reveals disparities, except more right-leaning recent Chinese immigrants who, and this is, you see this in Boston, who have the belief that it will undermine their growing political power. They don't object to Asian American, they just don't want it broken up so that you can see differences for Southeast Asians, South Asians, and East Asians, et cetera. They want to leverage the benefit of the number. It's actually a mathematical ploy, right? If you disaggregate, it changes your denominator that you use to calculate representation, overrepresentation, and underrepresentation. That's a prelude to the real answer to the question, which is, I think there's a problem. And here I'm going to be very particularly self-critical. So I'm of Chinese descent. Chinese Americans are the most sizable among Asian Americans, but I think there's a real problem that Chinese Americans are claiming the term Asian American as if it referred only to Chinese Americans. That's a problem. There are Korean Americans, there are Japanese Americans, there are South Asian Americans, and there are Southeast Asian Americans in particular, Vietnamese, Cambodians, people from Laos, the Hmong, who have a distinct set of issues. Some of this is related to military conflict the United States was directly involved in through the 60s and 70s. You've probably seen the T-shirts that say, "We're here because you were there," right? So there is a refugee population. Now we're second and third generation out from that. And also a Pacific Islander population with distinctive issues that have to do with colonialism. And that's all just wiped out when Asian American is treated as if it's synonymous with people of Chinese or sometimes Chinese, Japanese, Korean, right? But Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, is not the same as all of Asia. Asia is a vast territory. And at a later point, you could have me back, we can talk about the construction of Asian American identity and what even constitutes Asia or the Orient, because that's changed over time. Here, I'll just give you one quick data point. If you really want to be a historian, you can delve into this. You can Google this and take a look for yourself. So the word Orient, the Orient, which is sometimes synonymous with Asia, has changed over time from referring to the Asian continent, whether it refers to the Asian continent or to the Middle East. So, you know, the play Aladdin, which we now primarily associate with Arab or Middle Eastern visual thematic elements. If you go back and look at how Aladdin first came into Western culture about 1 century ago, it was almost always with a Chinese or East Asian set of features to the characters. So there was a huge movement in latitude and longitude for what we thought of as the Orient and Asia. You know, it's just sort of the exotic Far East. There was a point in time, by the way, when the United States actually defined this. The 1917 Immigration Act created an Asiatic barred zone. So, but by the way, if you didn't know this, and again, there's too much detail for us to cover, but look up two things. The first is the Asiatic barred zone. So many people know that in 1882, the United States Congress decided we're going to exclude everyone of Chinese descent, with a tiny, just a few as an exception. In 1917, they expanded that to all of Asia, but Asia is defined officially. There's an official definition of Asia by latitude and longitude. It's a vast part of the globe, and what was originally a Chinese Exclusion Act was expanded to cover this Asiatic barred zone. So just Google Asiatic barred zone 1917, and you'll get all the data you care to read about that. So there was once a negative way, a definition of Asia, and the purpose of that definition was let's keep all these people out. Right. The other interesting thing, nobody knows this. There used to be a color bar, a color line, an official legal color line, and Asians couldn't naturalize. So even if you had come legally, okay, and by the way, what counts as legal and illegal is varied over time, and it was until the 1980s never thought of as criminal nature. Again, top for the day. But in the 1920s, first someone of Japanese descent named Ozawa, and then someone of South Asian descent named Thind. They went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. You know why they went to the Supreme Court? They said, both Ozawa and Thind, we're white people. Why did they say we're white people? It's not because they wanted to be white people, because you had to be a free white person to naturalize. Now, many of you have naturalized. That's the process where you go from being a foreign national, different nation, to becoming an American. There's the whole test, et cetera. Ozawa and Thind both lost. The Supreme Court said to Ozawa, who said he was pale and assimilated, they said to Ozawa, you're not Caucasian, you lose because you're not scientifically right. Thind was next, not even a year later, 9 months later. Thind said, by the anthropology of the time, he was Caucasian. He said he was Aryan because he was high caste South Asian. And Supreme Court said, yeah, but the common man on the street would look at you and say, you're not white, therefore you lose. Thind and Ozawa, because they weren't white, couldn't become citizens. So there used to be an official color line that kept out Asians. And again, don't believe a word that I say. I say that because I want to get students to always do their own research. Look up 1917 Asiatic barred zone, and you can see the definition of what Asia was and how it couldn't come from Asia. And then look up Ozawa and Thind and color line on citizenship. And you'll see they had to argue I'm a white person, a free white person, because that was the prerequisite. So these are called the prerequisite cases. So there's all this history. And to turn back to the question that was asked, part of what critical race theory tries to do is just to say, look, here it is. And I'm less interested in what name is given to any particular movement among scholars. I'm just interested in, do you have proof? Do you have evidence for what you say? If you have evidence for what you say, I should be persuaded. If you don't have evidence for what you say, I'm skeptical, right? I don't care what you call it. I'm just interested in how good is your evidence. Show me your proof, right? And the question about the complexity of Asian America, that's a great question. These are all labels. They're a means to an end. And what is the end? The end is to achieve the racial justice, the diverse democracy, this ideal, Boston is a great place to talk about this, right? This is the city upon a hill, right? That's what it was called by the earliest Europeans to arrive. It was a phrase invoked by John F. Kennedy, most famously, the city upon a hill. Then it was used by Ronald Reagan. I think it's become a TV show by their name, right? But what does city by the hill refer to? It's this notion that America is going to be an experiment in self-governance, and it will beckon with freedom and opportunity the world over. That's what attracted my parents to these shores. And it's what attracted so many of us. And so everything that I have to say is in dedication to American ideals, that we will write the scripts of our own lives, and that we will make something here that is unique and, yes, is better than the places that our parents or grandparents fled from. And it's up to us to do that. It doesn't happen automatically. We make it happen. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And we have.
One more question. Okay.
Yeah, we still have
Sure,
time. We
sure.
still have time.
We have a comment. It's from Dr. Natalie Court. Thank you, Dr. Wu. Your brilliant work and your social justice leadership has been a model for me for many years as a disparities researcher and as I create and teach graduate diversity courses. My deepest appreciation.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, we should end on that positive note. Thank you.
So I've learned so much. I could listen to you all day, weeks, years. I just a wealth of knowledge and really have opened my eyes to a lot, especially about the history. And it's important, like you said to the students, is do your history, make your own decisions about things, right? Not just to listen. So I do deeply appreciate you coming in here today and sharing this all with us. So is there any, that's
We'll continue the conversation. Feel free to send me an email to say that we met virtually here, and I would welcome your further comments. I'm sure we will meet again. So thank you.
Thank you very much.